This morning's opening words come from Martha Kirby Capo, Many Paths. As we enter this sacred, silent space, let us renew both our commitment and our covenant. There are those among us who have endured a loss in the past week. May their hope be uplifted again in this community of faith. There are those among us who have struggled with hardship in the past week. May they find renewed strength in this community of faith. There are those of us who have wrestled with questions that seem to have no answer in the past week. May they find sanctuary during their search in this community of faith. There are those among us who have cherished an unexpected joy in the past week. May their rejoicing be celebrated in this community of faith. As we commit to continue our free and responsible search for truth, may we covenant to honor the many paths that have led us to this community of faith. So may it be. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to People's Church. Whether this is your first time at People's Church, or you come every Sunday, or anywhere in between, I welcome you. My name is Laura McClellan, and I'm from the Sunday Services Committee at People's Church. People's Church is a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association and part of a tradition of liberal religion. Here, our mission is to be a beloved community embracing and serving our diverse world. This morning, we are joined by Julie Mack. She has been a journalist for more than 40 years and works on MLive's statewide reporting team. She grew up in Jackson and has lived in Kalamazoo since 1990. She is married to Harold Boy, a retired Unitarian Universalist minister, and they have 3 grown children. Welcome, all. This morning's chalice lighting comes from Beth Sweinecke. May this flame. May this flame, symbol of transformation since time began, fire our curiosity, strengthen our wills, and sustain our courage as we seek what is good within and around us. If you are lighting a chalice at home, you are encouraged to type in the chat box, "A chalice is lit," and then your neighborhood, city, street, wherever you are. The annual meeting is scheduled for today, starting 10 minutes after the closing words for the service. For this reason, our coffee quarter today will be canceled. The meeting will take place in this Zoom room. The documents you will need for the meeting were included in the Friday email.
Good morning. Our story today is about 7 blind mice. Now, one day, these 7 blind mice were walking through a field when they ran into something that they had never seen before. They decided to figure out what it was. So, the first mouse went towards the front of the thing and ran around there. And he came back and said, "It's bendy and it moves. I think it's a snake." Well, the second mouse decided to run around the back of the thing, right here, to figure out what it was. And he came back and said, "It's thin and it has little bristles. I think it's a rope." Now, the next mouse ran around the bottom near the ground and he found big round things. And he said, "Guys, I think it's a tree." The next mouse was running around here, around this part of the thing, and it was big and strong, and it didn't move no matter how hard the mouse pushed on it. He said, "You know what? I think it's a wall." Well, the next mouse was up on top and was kind of feeling around this area and felt 2 big flappy things and said, "You know what? I think it's a fan." And the last mouse decided to run here near the front where the one thought it was a snake had run, and he found something long and sharp and pointy, and he said, "I think it's an arrow." But the last mouse didn't just focus on one side. He came up around the back and felt here. He felt around the bottom of the tree trunks and the big part of the wall. He felt around this flappy part up here and the big long part that twisted and the hard sharp part here. He said, "Well, I've made a discovery. You're right. It is round and solid like a tree trunk. And it does have a big solid part that you can't move like a wall. There is a part back here that is sort of ropey and has bristles. And there is a part up front that is long and moves by itself and feels a little like a snake. And there's a part that's hard and sharp near the front as well. And there are 2 big flappy things that do feel a little like fans. But this isn't any of those things. You know what it is? It's an elephant. An elephant, that's right. You see, you can learn stuff by knowing parts of a thing, but wisdom comes from seeing the whole picture. This is an old story. Lots of people tell it in lots of different ways. I'm going to add a piece by Derek Delgadio. And he says this: "You know, sometimes I wonder about this story, and I wonder how the elephant felt about it. The elephant was just there, minding its own business in the field, when all of a sudden these mice came up and started running all over him. And then they came back to him and they said, 'We figured out what you are. You're an elephant.' But what if they were wrong? Or, in this case, what if they were right the first time? What if they did stumble across a magical creature that had a snake for a nose and a rope for a tail and big tree trunks for legs and big fans up by its ears? I mean, they were blind. What if they just convinced themselves it was an elephant? Or worse, what if they convinced the creature that it was an elephant? And it didn't have anyone around who knew it and loved it for what it was and said, 'No, they're wrong. You are more than this.' I guess what I'm saying is, if you're a magical creature, don't let anyone tell you you're an elephant, especially not 7 blind mice."
The words for this morning's offering come from John Saxon. As a fire exists by burning. This religious community exists by its mission as a fire exists by burning. But a fire cannot burn without fuel. And it is the time, the energy, the imagination, the vision, the creativity, the compassion, the love, and the financial support of the members and friends of this community that fuels our mission to nurture and sustain a welcoming, inclusive, and diverse liberal religious community that transforms lives and serves the world. Your support, the free and generous support of each and every member and friend of this community, is what fuels this community and its mission. And without your support, the flame of justice, community, and love cannot burn brightly to warm ourselves and be a beacon in the world threatened by division and fear. Please give generously. Please join in giving thanks for all that sustains us. You can find the words in the chat box. From the countless gifts we each have been given, gifts of life and love and sustenance, we bring these small portions to share in the works of love, which none of us can accomplish alone. Each Sunday, we take a moment to share with one another the joys and sorrows, concerns and milestones in our lives. If you would like to share, please type your message into the chat box, and I will read your message aloud. If you would prefer not to share the details, you may type the word stone into the chat box, and we will keep you in our thoughts. I'm going to pause the recording now so that you have a measure of privacy. Our meditation is from monk Thich Nhat Hanh. As activists, we want to do something to help the world suffer less, Thich Nhat Hanh said. But when we're not peaceful, when we don't have enough compassion in us, we are unable to do much to help the world. Peace, love, and happiness must always begin in us, with ourselves first. There is suffering, fear, and anger inside of us, and when we take care of it, we are taking care of the world. Thich Nhat Hanh used the example of a pine tree and suggested, What if that tree asked us what it could do to help the world? Our answer would be very clear. You should be a beautiful, healthy pine tree. You help the world by being your best. That is true for humans also. The most basic thing we can do to help the world is to be healthy, solid, loving, and gentle to ourselves. Then, when people look at us, they will gain confidence and say, if he or she can do that, I can too. So anything you do for yourself, you do for the world, he said. Don't think that you and the world are two separate things. When you breathe in mindfully and gently, when you feel the wonder of being alive, remember that you're also doing this for the world. Practicing with that kind of insight, you will succeed in helping the world. You don't have to wait until tomorrow. You can do it right now.
We will now hear from our guest presenter, Julie Mack.
Thanks so much for having me today. And what I wanted to talk about today was what I've learned about truth over my 40-some-year career as a journalist. Truth is a very big deal for most journalists, and that's certainly true for me. The search for truth is what hooked me on journalism, and that specific event was the Watergate scandal. I was 13 when the scandal started, and I was reading everything that I could read about it. And of course, what especially fascinated me was the story of how these young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were able to help uncover the truth that Nixon and his minions were trying to cover up. So I started in journalism, enthralled by these very idealistic notions of searching for truth. And at that point, I saw truth in pretty simplistic terms. There was right versus wrong, truth versus lies. It was very black and white in my mind. And over the years, I've had to come to grips with some hard lessons about truth. The truth is often complicated. It can be a matter of perspective. It can be elusive. It can be painful. And truth doesn't always win. Sometimes facts just don't carry the day. So here are some of the lessons that I've learned about truth. Lesson 1, sometimes we simply don't know the truth. Truth is often murky. As a reporter, you learn this quickly because there are so many stories that are he said, she said, someone makes an accusation, the alleged perp denies it. Sometimes maybe The report of a racist comment from a store clerk, or an inappropriate remark by a teacher, or an accusation of sexual harassment or assault. How can we confirm for sure what happened? And the truth is, we really can't. Although, to be honest, it's a little easier today thanks to the ubiquitousness of emails and texts, videos and audio recordings. There tends to be more of a digital record than there ever was in the past. Think of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or all these other police-involved shootings where the story initially offered by police fell apart when we looked at the video evidence. But there's still many, many times we don't know the truth. And a classic example are some of the accusations of sexual misconduct levied against well-known people. Think of Brett Kavanaugh or Woody Allen, the rape accusation against Joe Biden last year. The fact is, we don't know what happened in those instances. And so much time has passed, it's likely to remain a mystery forever. People may think they don't know, but it's nothing more than an educated guess. Lesson 2, truth changes over time. And here I'm not talking about facts as much as the accepted truths in terms of societal norms. I was born in 1959. That means I grew up in a world where it was taken for granted by many that men were superior to women, that homosexuality was deviant behavior, interracial marriage was a radical act, sex before marriage was immoral. If you were an atheist, you kept it to yourself. And all these norms have been upended since I was a child. As a journalist, I've learned it's helpful to have that perspective, that the truths we embrace today may not be the truths we endorse down the road, and that what we see as true does evolve over time. Lesson number 3 is that truth does reflect an individual's lived experience. Have any of you ever seen the movie Rashomon? It's a 1950 Japanese movie in which various characters provide self-serving and contradictory versions of the same incident. As a journalist, it's something I've seen often. People can have wildly different perspectives involving a truth of the matter, even when the facts are not in dispute. I'm thinking, for instance, of a story I reported a few years ago in which a high school football coach routinely was smacking his players in the locker room, like physically hitting them hard enough to hurt. That was not in dispute. A parent heard about it and complained. An internal investigation was done. The coach admitted it. There was a letter that I actually obtained in his personnel file that documented the issue. But the interpretation of those facts divided the school community. And on one side were the parents and players who saw this as an abusive coach who should be fired, that there was no question about that. And on the other, and this was the majority view in that community, who thought that the issue was blown way out of proportion. And this is a pattern that I've often encountered when reporting stories. The debate often isn't over the facts, but what those facts mean and how people have very different reactions based on their own values and their own experiences. And I thought about this a lot last summer during the Black Lives Matter unrest. Because my take on racial injustice is definitely through the lens of an older white woman who tries to do the right thing. But racial injustice is not something I've really had to deal with much personally. And that is going to be a much different perspective than someone who is Black. And as a reporter, one of the most important aspects of my job is to get to gain insight into those perspectives different from my own, whether it's Trump voters or people of color or people of a generation or different parts of the state, to really listen what they have to say and think about their truth. So lesson 4 is that some things are beyond truth. And this is another lesson I've had to learn over the years, that some things are simply beyond the question of true or false. And the best example here is religion. I grew up Catholic. I have parents who are deeply faithful Catholics, the kind of Catholics who today go to daily mass and say the rosary. And they would tell you that one of the central truths in their lives that they hold dear is that Catholicism really is the one true faith. You can see this in many devoutly religious people, and not just Catholics, but evangelical Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, Muslims. There are many people who feel their religious path is the only path. And obviously, they can't all be right. But on the other hand, I don't know that they're wrong either from the standpoint this is about an individual truth. And sometimes those are the most important kinds of truths. So lesson number 5. The search for truth requires an open mind. And this is one of the most important skills I've had to learn as a journalist, is approaching things with an open mind and willing to realize that it may be different than I thought. And there's an old saying among journalists that if your mother says she loves you, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Verify everything. And the goal always is to try to get to the truth as much as possible. And sometimes, though, that truth is much more complicated or nuanced or different than I expected. But no question, keeping that open mind can be really, really hard. Confirmation bias is a huge issue for all of us, including journalists. And here is a cautionary tale for all journalists and all people, really, was this case of a now infamous Rolling Stone story published in 2014, detailing the story of a University of Virginia student who said she was gang raped by 7 people at her fraternity party. The woman's story was horrifying. She also totally made it up out of whole cloth. But somehow she was able to convince an award-winning journalist and the editors at Rolling Stone that this was true. So campus rape is indeed a very real thing. But in trying to illustrate that point, that reporter had a huge blind spot. She bought too hard into that idea that all alleged victims should be believed, and she failed to do some basic fact-checking to verify the woman's story. And it cost that reporter her journalism career. And it resulted in millions of dollars in libel lawsuit judgments against her and against Rolling Stone. The takeaway from that Rolling Stone story controversy to me is the importance of being aware of your inner bias, as well as the importance of healthy skepticism and not taking anything at face value. Lesson number 6, the truth can hurt. Part of approaching the risk of approaching things with an open mind is discovering unpleasant truths. A person you admire is accused of wrongdoing or is caught in a lie. A policy you thought was a good idea turns out to be a dismal failure. New information is made public that casts a controversy in a totally new light. One of the most important stories and difficult stories that I ever covered was the Larry Nassar sexual abuse scandal at Michigan State. You may remember that Nassar was a sports medicine doctor who sexually abused hundreds of female patients over a 25-year period. And he got away with it for that long because the abuse involved a type of digital penetration that he told the woman was a very specialized treatment for sports-related injuries. And one thing that was interesting in that case is that there were sort of 2 groups of victims. And the first were the women who almost immediately recognized or suspected that what he was doing was actually sexual abuse. Although, to be honest, those who complained about it were ignored. But nonetheless, there were women who sort of knew from the start, something is not right here. But then you had this other group of women. And that first group of women, by the way, they felt, validated and vindicated by Nassar's arrest. This confirmed what they had long, what their truth was is that I was being sexually abused by this guy. But there was also these patients who totally bought into the idea that this was a legit medical procedure, and they spent years as a Nassar patient undergoing this treatment. And it was interesting how emotionally crushed they were when what was going on really came to light. Here was someone they liked and trusted and admired who turned out to be their sexual abuser, and the women had felt like that they were complicit in allowing this to happen. As one woman said to me, it was like it brought her whole sense of judgment about everything into question. If this turned out to be so different than what she thought was happening all these years, what else was she wrong about? And it really showed me how learning the truth isn't always liberating. Sometimes it's devastating. Another lesson is that there's often multiple truths. I think in looking for truth, sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking there's a singular truth in a situation, when there are often multiple truths, and sometimes those truths seem to be contradictory. And I have to remind myself a lot of times that 2 things can be true at the same time. I mean, it's perfectly possible for someone like Harvey Weinstein to be a supporter of feminist causes and also a sexual harasser. It's possible to support Donald Trump's political agenda and oppose his lies, as Liz Cheney was doing. To see Michael Jackson as an extraordinary talented artist, but as someone who likely sexually abused children. And a corollary to this is that there's also partial truths. And sometimes what we see as disinformation actually has a kernel of truth in it, which is what appears to make it plausible. For instance, I had a story that I just wrote last week about the myth that the COVID vaccine causes infertility. Not true, by the way, absolutely does not. But this is a myth that gained traction on social media because these new types of vaccines work by changing a protein in the body, which generates an immune response. And an anti-vaxxer correlated that change in the protein to a protein that's in placentas and said, okay, so this vaccine is creating antibodies that attack the placenta, thus resulting in infertility and miscarriage. And none of that is true, but there was a kernel enough in there about the changing the protein that it sounded true and people bought into it. Lesson number 8 is the power of denial. Sadly, facts don't always win the day. And as a journalist, this is something I've seen time and time again. And we certainly saw this in a big way in the biggest stories of 2020 with the pandemic, the election, the Black Lives Matter movement. There are people who still think the election was stolen, even though there's no evidence to support that. There are people who deny that racial injustice exists, despite multitudes of examples to the contrary. COVID-19 has sickened millions of Americans over the past year, killed more than 500,000. But there are people who still see it as a hoax or fake news, and even larger numbers who say, okay, well, maybe it wasn't a hoax, but it's been seriously overblown. And that sense of denial, when people deny the facts, it can have real consequences. And we saw that with the January 6th insurrection. And we're seeing it now in the pandemic, because we now have a proven way to end this horrible public health crisis. Get vaccinated. And yet a significant number of people are resisting that. So over the past year, it certainly underscored to me the power of denial, the ability of people to rationalize positions that make no sense on its face. And that leads me to lesson number 9, which is the power of the narrative. The various news events of the past year certainly has me thinking about how and why so many people can buy into, seem allergic to the facts. And my sense is that a lot of this has to do with the power of narrative. And you know, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about this quote by Joan Didion. And she wrote years ago, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see. We select the most workable of the multiple choices." So that's what Joan Didion says, and I think she's onto something. Narratives are how we make sense of the world, and it's a device we all use. It's the lens, it's a lens through which we filter the news. And the problem is that, you know, many of us have wildly competing narratives, sometimes fueled by social media or news sources or political leaders who peddle disinformation or woefully incomplete information. And sometimes it's just about having very, very different perspectives. My son and I were talking about this just yesterday in regards to Israel and Palestine. The Israelis and the Palestinians each have, you know, very elaborate narratives of what's gone on in that region for the past 73 years or so. And they are very, very different narratives. And if you were to examine those narratives closely, my son was pointing out, it's not like either side is lying. It's just more about cherry picking facts to support their side of the story. And it's almost impossible to have any kind of resolution in that situation because the narratives are so different. And there's part of me that fears that that's where we're going now in America, that the political divisions are so deep and so raw. The narratives are so different that unity becomes, if not impossible, then very, very difficult. It was 245 years ago this July that a committee of men led by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams wrote some of the most enduring words in the English language. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and those include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Those are powerful, powerful words. But even at that time, what was held up as self-evident truths were pretty murky, right? It didn't include women, certainly didn't include Blacks or Native Americans. We're still arguing about what it means to have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so my point is that we were a country founded on certain core truths, but those truths are complicated. And 2.5 centuries later, they're still in dispute. So maybe it's not surprising that my career started out 40 years ago as a search for truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And now I'm about to retire, realizing how difficult that is. The truth comes in bits and pieces, and we each have to choose how to fit those pieces together and what to emphasize and what to leave out, and how to create a narrative that makes sense of things. And that narrative is going to vary, sometimes substantially, based on who is telling the story. The challenge is getting to the complete truth. And I don't know that I've ever achieved that, much to my despair and despite my best efforts. And that's the truth.
We laugh, we cry, we live, we die, we dance, we sing our song. We need to feel there's something here to which we can belong. We need to feel the freedom just to have some time alone. But most of all, we need close friends we can call our very own. And we believe in life and in the strength of love. And we have found a need to be together. We have our hearts to give, we have our thoughts to receive, and we believe that sharing is an answer. A child is born among us, and we feel a special glow. We see time's endless journey as we watch the baby grow. We thrill to hear imagination freely running wild. We dedicate our minds and hearts to the spirit of this child, and we believe in life and in the strength of love, and we have found a time to be together. And with the grace of age, we share the wonder of youth, and we believe that growing is an answer. Our lives are full of wonder, and our time is very brief. The death of one among us fills us all with pain and grief. But as we live, so shall we die, and when our lives are done, the memories we shared with friends, they will linger on and on. And we believe in life and in the strength of love, and we have found a place to be together. We have the right to grow, we have the gift to believe that peace within our living is an answer.
That Which is Worthy of Doing by Steve J. Crump. That which is worthy of doing, create with your hands. That which is worthy of repeating, speak with a clear voice. That which is worthy of remembering, hold in your hearts. And that which is worthy of living, go and live it now.
We seek elusive answers to the questions of this life. We seek to put an end to all the waste of human strife. summer.